Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Ben here, and today I am going to be talking about the Antonio Brown trade. Basically, my thoughts on it and a bit of why I think each team did it and stuff like that. So, first off, I want to just talk about some background on this if you're unfamiliar with the situation. I think a lot of people are pretty familiar, but some people are not for some reason. So, Antonio Brown's a receiver for the Steelers, and he had voiced some dissatisfaction with the team recently, and he was not happy with how he was being used. He didn't like Ben Roethlisberger. He had problems with Mike Tomlin. He thought that those two were in cahoots and they were against him for some reason. He thought that they were using Juju Smith-Schuster too much compared to him. He thought he was more talented and that he should get more touches and stuff like that. So he demanded a trade. His agent is Drew Rosenhaus, who's a big deal in the NFL. He's one of the biggest agents. And so they were looking around, and actually a few days ago, they were looking to get him to the Bills, but then that trade broke down. And so then they were shopping around, and then the Raiders came calling and asked for him, and he got traded to the Raiders last night, very late, like 11 o'clock. So if you don't know, the Steelers got a third round pick and a fifth round pick in exchange for Antonio Brown. So now I'm going to talk about this trade from both teams' side and then from Antonio Brown's perspective. Well, actually, I'll start with Antonio Brown's perspective. I think he'd probably be pretty happy with this trade. He's going to a team that has an established quarterback in Derek Carr. He is going to be the undisputed number one option, which he wanted to be. Um, and it's not a team that's terrible, and that I think they have three first round picks this year, I think, and then they have him and Derek Carr and Marshawn Lynch and Jordy Nelson. So there are some decent pieces surrounding this team, and I think that although I don't see them making like the playoffs this year, but I do see them being maybe 8-8 or 9-7 if they bounce back really well, and if the first round picks pan out, I could see them being around 8-8. I think they were 4-12 last year, if I am correct. Derek Carr missed some, or I think Derek Carr missed some time last year, if I am accurate in saying that. But overall, I think that they'll be a better team, and they got uh, Antonio Brown for very little, and I think that for those reasons he should be pretty happy, and that it's not like they gutted their team to get him, and they won't be a contender. I think although they're not currently a contender, they might get a bit better this next season and be like 8-8, as I say. So from Oakland's perspective, it overlaps with Antonio Brown's a little bit in that they're probably pretty happy in that a third round pick and a fifth round pick is pretty modest to get what most people would say is the best receiver in the NFL. I honestly don't understand what their strategy is, though. I thought, in getting rid of Khalil Mack and getting rid of Michael Crabtree and getting rid of Amari Cooper, that they were going for a full-on rebuild. But now they've gotten rid of all those guys. But now they bring in Antonio Brown, and they kind of undo what they just did in getting rid of all those guys. So I'm not really sure what the direction is. If I were them, I would have kept Amari Cooper and would have kept Khalil Mack and then acquired Antonio Brown. But I guess they didn't want to do that, or John Gruden didn't want to do that. But yeah, I think they obviously acquire a top tier talent kind of guy, and so they're definitely very happy about that. I think that he is a good player. He's a weird personality. I think we've all seen in the past couple of weeks and months that he is an odd guy, but he is good. And I think that is something that Oakland needs. Is just talented players, especially receivers, because Derek Carr doesn't have much of anybody to throw to right now. I think like Seth Roberts was their best guy. Jordy Nelson too, but Jordy's a bit older, but he's still a good player. Um, but yeah, so I think it's good for them to get some weapons. Now, finally, from the Steelers' perspective, I do not understand why. I mean, I get that the options were maybe limited, but I feel like they just didn't get much in return. Oakland has all these first round picks this year. Why don't they just ask for like one first round pick from them instead of a third and a fifth? I don't get that. I think that they could have demanded a lot more for Antonio Brown, but they didn't. Um, and the reasons aren't really very clear. But I think that they'll be fine without him. If you look at the long line of receivers that Aaron or that Ben Roethlisberger's propped up, um, guys like Santonio Holmes, who was great in Pittsburgh, goes somewhere else. Like he went to the Jets afterward, and he was still okay, but not as good. Um, You look at other guys like Mike Wallace, Martavius Bryant. Um, I think Antonio Brown won't be the next version of those guys. He will still be pretty good, but I think people take for granted Ben Roethlisberger's level of talent, and they are just like a factory for producing good wide receivers. So as I say, Mike Wallace and Martavis Bryant are sort of the best examples of this. Guys who were like nobodies on the Steelers, and then they kind of rose up when other guys left. Like Mike Wallace became more prominent when like Hines Ward and Santonio Holmes left. And then when Mike Wallace left is when like Antonio Brown and Martavis Bryant kind of came along and started to get better. But there's just odd pattern with the Steelers where they got these underrated homegrown wide receiver talents. And so the three I'm going to focus on are Mike Wallace, Martavis Bryant, and Antonio Brown. But then they get too big for their britches and they want to leave. So that happened with Mike Wallace and Martavis Bryant. They both were dissatisfied with the team, wanted to be paid more, wanted to be more of a focal point, and left. Same thing happened with Antonio Brown now. He was like a fourth round pick. He was like the fifth receiver on the roster, but then guys like Mike Wallace leave, and then they're kind of looking at a void at receiver, and he steps up, has a few good games, has then a few more good games, becomes a prominent part of the offense, and becomes the best receiver in the NFL. Um, and now you got Juju Smith-Schuster, who's a homegrown talent. Nobody knew who he was really coming out, and then you see that now there's a void. Antonio Brown is leaving. Martavis Bryant, well, initially last year Martavis Bryant left, so then he went into like the definitive number 2 slot. And now this year, Antonio Brown is gone, so he's going to be a much more prominent part of the team and the number 1 option. So it'll be interesting to see if down the road, if he, like these other 3 guys, wants more money and ends up leaving. But I think it's really hard to evaluate the worth of a wide receiver because it's so contingent on a quarterback. Now, yes, you can have a really good receiver with a really bad quarterback, but I feel like usually there's a correlation. I feel like maybe an outlier here would be like Odell and Eli Manning. Eli Manning's not putrid, but he's just not that great anymore. But Odell is still a really good receiver despite playing with an underperforming quarterback. But really, if you look around the league, I guess AJ Green's another good example with Andy Dalton, a mediocre to average quarterback, but like a really good receiver. But it's just hard to evaluate their talent because I feel like historically, a lot of the best receivers have had really good quarterbacks. Like um, Randy Moss had Dante Culpepper during his prime, who was a Pro Bowler. Also had Tom Brady, who was arguably the GOAT of football. You look at Jerry Rice, he had Joe Montana, and then he had Steve Young. You look at Terrell Owens, who had Tony Romo, a Pro Bowler. He had Donovan McNabb, a Pro Bowler. He had Steve Young, a Hall of Famer. So, like, another guy who, a really good receiver, but it's not like he was being thrown to by terrible, terrible players either. You look at other great receivers I'm trying to think of right now, like Ocho Cinco, he had Carson Palmer, who was a Pro Bowler. And now, like, you might say, well, Carson Palmer and Steve Young, you're mentioning in the same argument. It's not that they're the same type of player. I just want to point out that, like, a lot of good wide receivers have a talented person throwing them the ball, which is the case in Pittsburgh, is that they always have a Pro Bowler or a Pro Bowl caliber player in Ben Roethlisberger throwing the ball to them. And I'll just be interested to see how AB does with a quarterback who is. He did actually make a Pro Bowl 2 years ago, but he is definitely a less talented player than Ben Roethlisberger. So it'll just be interesting to see how Antonio Brown performs in a situation where things aren't going to be as easy. You won't have a great running back who can alleviate pressure. Marshawn Lynch is good, but he's not as good as James Conner was last year, and he isn't as good as Le'Veon Bell has ever been. So it'll just be interesting, and I look forward to seeing what happens, and I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Hope you have a good day. If you have any comments, leave them below. I'd love to hear from you. Antonio Brown's a Raider. Interesting stuff. Have a good day. Bye.